Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback from Colorado, is the most divisive prospect in this year's NFL draft. Being the son of Hall of Famer and football royalty Deion Sanders, the expectations and discussions around Shedeur as a prospect were always going to be charged. Some have written him off as only being relevant thanks to the Sanders name, whilst others think he's the best quarterback in this draft class. The truth, though, lies somewhere in between those two extremes. Before we even look at some plays from Shedeur Sanders' tape and start assessing his strengths and weaknesses, we first have to start with his offensive line, because understanding the Colorado offensive line is essential context for evaluating Shedeur. To make a long story short, the Colorado offensive line has not been good for both years that Shedeur Sanders was the Buffalo's quarterback. In 2023, the Colorado offensive line allowed the 8th most pressures in the FBS with 144. In 2024, it did improve only because Deion Sanders threw so many resources at the offensive line that they eventually found a strong enough starting rotation, but nevertheless, it still wasn't good, allowing the 23rd most pressures at 123. You can see from some of these clips here just how bad the Colorado offensive line has been at points over the last 2 years. There are countless dropbacks where Shedeur is under pressure almost immediately after the snap, and as a quarterback, it can be very challenging to produce in that environment if you can't offset the offensive line issues by having elite physical traits, or if you're not a rushing threat. But sacks aren't just an offensive line stat. Quarterbacks are also responsible for their own pressure rate, which is why the Colorado offensive line has quote-unquote only been credited with 123 pressures, while Shedeur Sanders has 188 total pressure dropbacks this year, technically making him the most pressured quarterback in the country. But that's because Shedeur Sanders is responsible for a significant amount, basically a third, of his own pressures. Essentially, Shedeur made his bad offensive line worse by holding onto the ball for too long and taking too many sacks. These are Shedeur's time to throw and pressure to sack rates, meaning how often does a pressure become a sack. As you can see in 2023, Shedeur's pressure to sack rate was very high at over 25%, and his time to throw was also on the higher side at 2.89 seconds. In 2024, his pressure to sack rate fell to 19.7%, but his time to throw has gone up to an average of 3 seconds, with that time skyrocketing to over 3.5 seconds when targeting beyond 10 yards. Having a time to throw of 3 or more seconds in an offense which doesn't run a lot of play action and throws screen passes 22% of the time is honestly mind-boggling to me, because it just doesn't make any sense given there is basically no reason to hold onto the ball for that long. A bad offensive line, no play action, lots of short throws and screens, but somehow Shedeur Sanders manages to do it. On this play against BYU, Shedeur not only holds onto the ball for longer than he should, but he also drifts back in the pocket. I think this is because he's worried about his offensive line not being able to hold up against the pressure, so he thinks it will buy him some more time. But really, it just makes the jobs of his offensive tackles harder, because now the angle that they're blocking for to protect Shedeur is now wrong. They're expecting Shedeur to not be so deep in the pocket, so now the angle for the edge rusher is so much easier. Not only does Shedeur hold onto this ball for too long and drift dangerously deep in the pocket, but he also proceeds to then take a massive sack, putting Colorado out of field goal range. You can't have that in the NFL. I also think part of the reason why Shedeur holds onto the ball for too long generally is because he doesn't have the arm strength to fit the ball into tighter windows. I think his arm strength is fine. I definitely wouldn't say it's better than that though. I'd compare it to a Joe Burrow. You can see on this play here how Shedeur has a receiver open or coming open in between the zone defenders, but he doesn't pull the trigger on what I would say is a fairly routine NFL throw. On this play here, Shedeur has Travis Hunter wide open down the sideline for what should be a touchdown or at least a chunk play, but it is massively underthrown, with Hunter having to work back through contact to try and make the play. This did draw a pass interference flag, so technically it was a positive play, but from the perspective of evaluating Shedeur Sanders as a quarterback, it was not a good one. You'll see a similar thing on this play versus Arizona. The slot receiver is going to come wide open on a post, which should be a touchdown, but because the ball is underthrown, the receiver has to slow down to catch it, meaning he's tackled short of the end zone. It might seem like a small thing, but in the NFL, that could be the difference between a 7-point touchdown or a 3-point field goal. I would say that on the whole, Shedeur is averse to risky throws. I can't show you this because it's the lack of evidence which is making me believe that, but I would say generally, there is a lack lack of wow plays on Sanders' tape. Sure, there are some nice throws, and I will go on to show you those, but those top tier plays, especially the ones out of structure, which the top 7 quarterbacks make on a weekly basis, are few and far between. So not only do I question if Shedeur can regularly make those tight window NFL level throws, but I also have concerns about his athleticism. Shedeur isn't a statue who has to stay in the pocket like a Jared Goff or even like a Joe Burrow. He's got a bit more wiggle to him than that. You can see him pull a read option for a touchdown here. But on any given play when Shedeur does decide to take off, it's essentially a coin toss as to whether or not he can outrun an average college defensive lineman. So he's definitely not a value add in the run game, and defenses aren't going to have to account for him as a rusher. Those are his weaknesses, but what about Shedeur's strengths? Well, despite the fact that I've basically been bashing him for the last few minutes, Shedeur does have strengths. Shedeur is a traditional pocket passer who can create and make plays from the pocket. He doesn't have those top tier physical tools, but he definitely has enough between his ears and good enough accuracy and ball placement to make plays from the pocket. In the season opener against North Dakota State, Shedeur had 5 big time throws and was really slinging it, throwing fades deep down the field to the sideline from the opposite hash and hitting the receiver perfectly in stride. This is an NFL throw. Stepping up into a compressing pocket and throwing a bomb to his receiver in the deep third, which was taken in for a touchdown. That's an NFL throw. Shedeur was on fire in this game, and granted, it wasn't against top talent, but it was the game in which he was not only kept relatively clean by his offensive line, but also where Sanders kept himself clean, only taking 1 sack with a pressure to sack rate of just 8.3%, which was comfortably the best of his Colorado career. Generally, when Sanders was kept clean by his offensive line, he was able to make some nice throws, throwing with anticipation, timing, and rhythm. When I see these plays, I totally understand why people are high on him. And if you can explain away some of Shedeur's shortcomings as an unfortunate byproduct of him playing with a bad offensive line, then I can see why some people are very high on him. When he's not drifting too deep in the pocket as we saw earlier, Shedeur generally also has good pocket feel. He's able to step up and extend the play slightly from within the pocket, give himself just enough space and time to throw with his quick release and get the ball out. There's one more thing we need to consider here though, and that's what I call the Sanders circus. Dion has already made it very clear there are certain teams he would not let his son play for, which I find hilarious because I don't think Sanders is that level of prospect to be pulling an Eli Manning. And Dion will be very vocal in the media about the team that drafts him if he thinks they're not doing right by his son or if they're just doing badly generally. To be fair, Shedeur has actually remained pretty level-headed throughout the whole of his college career, so it's not a knock against him personally, but I think he does come with, let's say, family baggage, which NFL teams would be foolish to not weigh up, because personality and fit is a massive part of evaluating a draft prospect, as is creating a good team culture and a good locker room culture. My pro comparison for Shedeur Sanders is a weaker armed Geno Smith, which I think is more of his ceiling, and genuinely I mean that as a compliment, because I think Geno Smith has played some great football for the Seahawks over the last 2 years. I also think there are slight elements of Kirk Cousins to his game, but I'll let you guys decide if you think that's a positive or a negative. Like I said, there are things I genuinely like about Shedeur Sanders as a prospect. I think he's a starting caliber NFL quarterback, and if he has a good offensive line, I can see him being successful in the league. But that's the issue. He is a quarterback who is at the mercy of the quality of his supporting cast. Yes, Shedeur can create from the pocket, and yes, he can make basically all of the throws he needs to within structure. But the NFL is now at the point where if you don't have a top 10 quarterback, you are going to struggle. Your quarterback needs to have at least one of elite arm talent, elite accuracy and ball placement, or elite athleticism, and be able to make plays out of structure. Shedeur Sanders definitely does not have elite athleticism or elite arm strength. He does have good ball placement and accuracy, but it's not enough to offset my concerns about the other two, and I don't think he can regularly make those top tier plays out of structure. With that in mind, you're going to hear a lot of Joe Burrow comparisons to Shedeur Sanders, and I get where the comparisons are coming from. If you squint really hard, they are sort of similar. But Shedeur Sanders is not Joe Burrow as a passer. Ultimately, I think Shedeur Sanders is definitely a quarterback you can win with. I think he'll operate an offensive system the way the head coach or offensive coordinator wants it to be run. And with a good supporting cast, I think he can be a decent NFL starter. but I don't think he's a quarterback that you can win because of. So I would not use a top 10 pick on him, certainly not the first overall pick. But he is my 20th ranked player and very comfortably my QB2 in this draft class. So I still see him as a mid-first round player. As I said at the start though, the discourse around Sanders is so extreme. You either think he's going to be a Nepo baby or is the clear-cut QB1. When I first turned on Sanders' tape, I was expecting to see a Nepo baby who was only getting any attention because of the Sanders name on his back. That is absolutely not the case. He can be an NFL quarterback in his own right. He's just not my QB1.